This podcast comes to you from the University of Toronto, Mississauga. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the university operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We are grateful to work on this land, and we strive toward peace and reconciliation among all peoples. Hi, I'm Jill Caskey, Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Welcome to Medieval Art Matters, a podcast that showcases the vitality of contemporary research on the Middle Ages. In each episode, we invite a scholar to talk about a critical issue that shaped the experiences of people living centuries ago and that still matters today. I'm joined today by my co-host, Professor Erika Loic, for a discussion of today's theme, concepts of race and depictions of racial difference in medieval art.
Hi, I'm Erika Loic, Assistant Professor of Global Medieval Art at Florida State University. My work focuses on the Iberian Peninsula, the art of the book, and digital tools for research and teaching. Our guest today is Dr. Pamela Patton. She is Director of the Index of Medieval Art at Princeton University. Her scholarship asks how images helped to articulate identity and shape social dynamics among the multi-ethnic communities of the Iberian Peninsula. Her books include the monograph Art of Estrangement, Redefining Jews in Reconquest Spain, and the edited volume Envisioning Others, Race, Color, and the Visual in Iberia and Latin America. Her most recent and forthcoming articles address the significance of depicted skin color in Iberia and its neighbors.
Welcome, Dr. Patton, and thank you so much for being on our show.
Oh, you're welcome, and thank you for having me. And I'd like to add, I'm speaking to you here from my home outside Princeton. It's on the traditional territory and homeland of the Lenape people, to whom I pay respect.
Thank you, Pamela. So we're going to jump right in. And for this podcast, we're looking at a specific work. And for those listening, it's on the podcast page of artofthemiddleages.com. So Dr. Patton, could you tell us a little bit about the book where this image comes from? So the Cantigas de Santa Maria in general.
We're looking here at a visualization of a vocal narrative, a song that was composed at the court of Alfonso X in Castile. He was a wise king. He was a very scholarly person. And although he was very much engaged in political machinations, in that he had just sort of overseen a massive takeover of Muslim ruled territory in southern Iberia, he also was quite interested in culture and provoked a whole number of projects at his court in the time that he ruled. This is between 1252 and 1284. Scientific endeavors and musical endeavors and historical endeavors, most of them in Castilian, but this collection of songs in Galician Portuguese, which was a poetic language. You're looking at an image that is from one of the illustrated collections of these songs, the Cantigas de Santa Maria, the Canticles of the Virgin Mary, in which the basic narrative of each story that is recorded there with its notation is also visualized. So we see 6 scenes that represent the tales that, in this case, a particularly interesting tale of a Muslim commander who converts to Christianity.
So could you tell us a little bit about this page in particular and what's happening? What are we seeing?
Well, we're seeing a sort of a comic book style illustration of the story. It's one that attempts to sort of encapsulate the major episodes of the story. And one of the things that makes that most interesting is that this is an opportunity for the artist to emphasize those aspects of the story that he or she, but probably in this case a he, thought was most important. In this case, there's a real emphasis on moments in the narrative or relationships among the characters that struck the artist as particularly valuable. And this is neat because in the grand scheme of things, this is a well-known narrative. This is one that was repeated in Europe elsewhere before it was borrowed by Alfonso and his compositors. So it's a very well-known story, and the artists were, in that case, kind of able to embroider upon the tale as they knew it, as well as the tale as it was told in the cantigas themselves. One thing I suspect is that the artist didn't really look that closely at the texts that were written down in the same book, because in many cases like this one, they already knew the story. It was like saying, make an illustration of Little Red Riding Hood. They're going to know the story. They're going to tell you the parts that they think are interesting. And I think that's what you're seeing in this image. The basic narrative is that there's a Muslim commander who's on a campaign in the Holy Land. They capture a site and they take advantage of all the booty that they've been able to collect. And this particular commander claims an image of the Virgin Mary, which is the crux of the narrative. He takes it home, he sets it up in his house, and he's transfixed by it, and he keeps talking to it and asking it, if you're so holy, if you're truly the Mother of God, can't you just help me believe that? Because, Muslims, as Alfonso knew, as the compositors of Cantiga knew, Muslims honored the Virgin Mary as the mother of Jesus, whom they saw as a holy man. So Mariam is already a part of their religious tradition, but she was not the mother of God, and that was the line. So here's the Muslim commander going, I just can't believe that part. Help me believe that part. And according to the tale, the image begins to lactate, and milk streams from its breasts, and the commander is converted. He's astounded, and he believes that she is truly the mother of God, and he becomes a Christian. And that's what you see going on in the last scene. He's actually kneeling for baptism. And rather unusually, he's kneeling nude. He's actually on this little platform, having water poured over his head as his family look on. And generally, baptisms in the Cantigas show people seated in a font. So this is a peculiar and very interesting detail of this particular story.
So I want to pick up on this idea of bodies and skin and nudity that you've already introduced here. So you could say there are several categories of difference in an image like this. We can talk about Christian and non-Christian, different colors of skin. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this in the Middle Ages or in the specific case of Iberia. Do you think there was more emphasis on those categories of difference that could be changed? So religion, practice, ritual, or more interest in those categories of difference that can't be changed, like skin color?
That's a great way to frame the question, because difference was in many cases seen as something changeable, right? If it's a religious difference or a cultural difference, even though that was seen as a quasi-racial thing, being Muslim was being part of a people in a way for the Middle Ages that is not quite seen the same way for modern people, or being Jewish or being Christian. What were they more interested because it was changeable? I think in medieval Iberia, they probably were, because concerns about conversion, concerns about contact among cultures sometimes erupted into discomfort, right? So especially when you've just captured a whole swath of land where there's a minority population, or even a majority minority population that is different from you, you're uneasy about that, whether it's a Muslim ruler or a Christian ruler. You've got to figure out how you're going to handle that. So there was a lot of interest in the possibility of converting people who are different, whose religious beliefs are different, the possibility of bringing people with linguistic differences into the fold. I think you've also noticed that there are differences in skin color here, and to a certain extent in somatotype, especially in the first scene where there are black soldiers carrying spears, infantry who are marching along with the Muslim army. That kind of difference, I think, was seen, I almost want to say with less anxiety, because it was seen as a sort of more exotic thing. This is more a mark of foreignness and of people who live somewhere else than it was a mark of a proximate minority or a proximate other. And so we'll see dark-skinned figures like this in the Cantigas sometimes as an indicator of distance, like this is someone from far away. And we'll sometimes see it as an indicator of social class. And that is a really interesting one. That's something I'm working on now in my own scholarship, that often you'll see slaves and servants, but most often enslaved people represented with dark skin. And this is not because Black people were enslaved in any great numbers in Iberia in the 13th century. In fact, there were relatively few Black slaves throughout the peninsula. There were more in the Muslim-ruled lands. There were relatively few in Christian-ruled lands, really until the 14th and 15th centuries. So it wasn't a matter of representing the way people looked or representing a class of people who were generally enslaved. It's an easy slip for North Americans to make because we're so used to the idea of slavery based on race. In the Middle Ages, it was based on race, but in a different way. Basically, if you're not one of us, we can enslave you. It almost doesn't matter what. For a Muslim, enslaving a Christian of any ethnicity was fine. For a Christian, enslaving a Muslim the same way, because the religious difference was what mattered. So that kind of difference is not one that I think provoked the same kind of concern for changeability. It was simply one that helped to mark people as performing a certain role in the image, possibly marking them as performing a certain role in society.
So I think I heard you use the word somatotype. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yeah.
So for our listeners, can you tell us what kinds of qualities, traits, what counts as somatotype, and how do you use that word?
Yeah, well, somatotype technically means body type, physical type. And what we see, especially in the first panel of this illustration, is a group of figures. They're all Muslim. This is the interesting thing. Everyone in this first panel is a Muslim soldier of some kind. The higher status figures, the ones who are cavalry, the commander himself, who's just visible there wearing a white turban, are shown as pale-skinned figures who are not physiognomically that different. Their facial features are not that different from the Christians in the same manuscript. Whereas some of the infantry are dark-skinned, and they have sort of stereotyped features that emphasize lips and nose shape in a way that resembles sub-Saharan Africans of the time. So it's not a realistic or mimetic reflection, at least in the practice of the artists. It's a way of differentiating these lower status figures, these soldiers and possibly slave soldiers, from the other figures in the image.
It's interesting to me how you see in the battle or the top two panels how there is this great diversity, not only of kind of skin colors, but also horses. And in a way, it seems like you're getting a view of the power and the diversity of this army, or power through diversity. And as the image kind of moves through the page, that starts to dissipate or disappear.
Starts to bubble away. Yeah, that's a very interesting observation. It's hard to tell because I think most of the time when people look at this image, they do think of it as suggesting diversity in a very realistic way. I think you have to filter that a little bit through the conventions that artists used. The artists weren't saying, well, let's make sure we show Africans and let's make sure we show people of mixed race. But they were saying, let's show people of certain social classes and people who perform certain roles in the army. And those happen to use a sort of diverse visual language. So as long as we understand that we're sort of a few layers away from actually representing what the artist saw, I think the scene where the figure is picking up the icon is a really telling one, because the commander himself is the man with the black beard and the white turban, and he's holding it up, and he's holding up his right finger in a sort of discursive gesture, like, I have something to say about this. I am interested in this image. Usually when a figure in this manuscript holds up a finger, it's because he or she is speaking or teaching. And so, it's an implication that this figure has some sort of knowledge. On the other hand, he's facing off with a group of other Muslims who are holding various other kinds of things. And I think the one black figure there is really significant in that he's holding up his hand in surprise in a way that nobody else does, in a way emphasizing the break with the Muslim traditions of the figure, a break with that community. In a way that's just very visible because of his dark skin. And he also is holding a luxurious garment, kind of a silk garment, over his arm. The guy behind him is holding a gold vessel of some kind. And it's a real contrast to the commander who's holding this painting, which would have occupied such a complicated place in Islamic life in Iberia. I mean, they certainly had images and made images in Muslim ruled Spain, but they tended to be much more secular in those images, and representations of holy figures were really avoided. So the idea that this figure is not just eschewing all of the material goods in the image, but also holding up a picture, which the Christians would have understood to be kind of controversial, I think would have made this a very dramatic image.
Within that context of multicultural Spain and the fact that these groups had been living together sometimes at peace, and then during the Reconquista, not so much. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the architectural setting of the last three scenes?
Yes, yeah. And I should say, I'm not sure there's a simple progression from living together comfortably and then not. There are phases in different parts of Iberia that are marked by great cooperation and relative tolerance of each other, and then there are phases that are marked by great hostility. And art historians still, Iberianists particularly, still sort of debate what we're supposed to call this. Some people used to use the word convivencia, which now gets too positively interpreted. Convivencia means living together. It doesn't mean liking it. I say I live with my husband's baseball card addiction, but that doesn't necessarily mean, I actually love my husband's baseball cards, but, there are things you live with that you don't love and things you live with because you've chosen to, like the husband himself. So there's a very varied experience in medieval Iberia. And I always tell my students that before you decide whether people are getting along with each other, you have to know where you are and when you are. Because Toledo in 1084 is quite different from Toledo in 1086, after the city's been conquered by Castilians. Before that, it's Muslim ruled. It's a whole different place. Okay, so all of that said, there's a lot of exchange, whether relationships are hostile or friendly. There's a lot of admiration for good art in all of the cultures of the Iberian Peninsula. And if you're making something good or something valuable or something beautiful, it's going to be borrowed, whether or not it belongs to the other guy. You see that in a way in the capture of the icon. These guys are not uncomfortable with the garments and the swords and the armor or the images of the other side. They pick them up, they take them home. In this particular case, what we're seeing, however, is this sort of fantastical Muslim interior, I guess. This is what a medieval artist would have envisioned a household looking like. There's a lot of use of textiles. Their silk hangings were common not just in Islamic interiors, but in Christian interiors as well. So to see this drape hanging over the woman with her child is quite unsurprising. I mean, you see that in Christian interiors as well. What marks this as more distinctively Muslim, I think, is the way they've put inscription front and center. And I think the prominence of the inscription is a way of suggesting that from the artist's perspective. It's also, there's a beautiful drape on the table. This little edicula rests on with the image inside it. And you might also notice that the woman is sitting on the floor. This is the wife of the commander. And sitting on the floor was the norm for everyone in medieval Iberia. They just didn't have a lot of chairs. In Andalusi lands, it was completely customary to sit on cushions, and a lot of Christian cultures began to adopt that practice. So at Alfonso's court, there's no doubt that most people were also sitting on cushions. And in fact, you'll sometimes see scenes of the king with his court in which that's the case, in which they're all sitting on the ground or they're sitting on a pillow. He will sit on the throne because he's the king. In a way, this is a pan-Iberian interior. There's not that much that's specifically Islamic about it, in that all of those forms really could be found elsewhere.
Maybe if I can ask you a more general question that's not specific to this image, but more about your field and where you see it going or where you would like it to go.
Wow. I think it's going in very interesting directions. There's been, for probably 2 or 3 decades, a lot of interest in the multiculturalism of Iberian history, in what that really means for the way we understand history, but also what that means for the way we understand the works of art that were produced there. There's an increasing nuance to our understanding of these works. I think we're becoming much more sensitive to the fact that answers are different in different parts of the peninsula at different times, which is very valuable. I think we're also becoming more attentive to the voices outside of the largely Christian authorities from whom our evidence comes. Because of the history of the peninsula, a lot of the images, a lot of the objects, and even the buildings, even if they didn't originate within a Christian-ruled context, were absorbed into a Christian-ruled context if they survived. And so they've been filtered down to us in this way. So, the voice of a Latinate Christian culture has been very powerful in our understanding of a lot of works, where I think we really ought to be thinking more about the Muslim cultures that created them, about the alternate perspectives that Muslim or Jewish viewers might have brought to the things that they made. So I think that we're becoming a very interesting and exciting and nuanced field. What I'd like to see happen that I don't see happening yet is greater engagement between Iberianists and those who work in other parts of the medieval world. There's been a little bit more move to an interdisciplinarity and an interregional approach that I think is very good. I'm really encouraged to see that. And I think that's going to enrich our field as well as the field of those outside, in all parts of the medieval world.
It sounds like we need to go beyond convivencia among scholars. We shouldn't just tolerate or live with each other in the same spaces.
That's a very good way to put it.
Thank you so much. That was all very fascinating.
Thanks, Dr. Patton, for coming to speak with us today.
Oh, I was very happy to. Thank you for having me.
That was Dr. Pamela Patton of the Index of Medieval Art at Princeton University on race and representation in medieval Iberian art.
You've been listening to an episode of Medieval Art Matters, hosted by Erika, Loic, and me, Jill Caskey. Medieval Art Matters complements the book written by Jill Caskey, Adam Cohen, and Linda Safran, entitled Art and Architecture of the Middle Ages, Exploring a Connected World. It is published by Cornell University Press. For more information, go to the website that accompanies the book, artofthemiddleages.com, where you'll also find more podcasts in the series.
Medieval Art Matters is made possible by the support of the Department of Art History at the University of Toronto St. George campus and the Office of the Vice Principal Academic and Dean, University of Toronto, Mississauga. Many thanks to the Toronto Consort for providing the music Como poden per sas culpas, meaning because of his sins. The lyrics describe how the Virgin Mary healed a sinful man's paralyzed limbs after he repented. The piece actually comes from the Cantigas de Santa Maria, the manuscript we've been discussing today.
This podcast was brought to you by Cited Media Productions. Thanks for listening.
You have been listening to a Cited Media production. CIDED. Find out more at citedmedia.ca.